The mechanic found his dead wife after 20 years. Beside her stood a young woman with his eyes. For 20 years, Callum Ashford believed his wife had drowned in the black water beneath Ravenswood Lake, where a burned-out car had been pulled from the depths, though no body was ever recovered. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his evenings with engine grease and silence instead of a grief he refused to name. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the Ravenswood train station, he saw a face he had buried 2 decades earlier. Beside her stood a young woman with gray eyes that matched his own eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror, and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him, trembling, and whispered 4 words that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to say her name, because someone was still watching them. If you want to know how a wife the world had called dead survived 20 years in silence, stay until the end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. The station. Callum had come to the Ravenswood train station for nothing more complicated than a crate of parts for the 1967 Mustang sitting half-finished in his shop. He'd expected the afternoon to end the way most of his afternoons ended, grease under his fingernails, the radio playing low while he worked in peace. His life had settled into something manageable over the years, a small restoration garage on the edge of town, a house that still smelled faintly of sawdust, and a son named Devon, who called less often now that he'd built a career of his own 2 states away. Callum had made peace, or something close to it, with the shape his life had taken after the accident that stole his wife from him when Devon was barely 3 years old. He did not expect the crowd at the station to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman standing near the ticket counter whose face stopped his breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, and her eyes kept sliding toward the exits the way a person's eyes move when they've spent years learning not to be found. The station smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and somewhere behind him a departure board clattered through its rotations, but Callum barely registered any of it. His whole body narrowed down to the single fact of her face. He told himself it was impossible that grief could conjure faces out of strangers if a man let it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that this wasn't a trick of memory. It was Isla. His wife, the woman he'd married in a church with peeling paint and buried in a coffin the coroner had sworn contained her remains, was standing 30 feet away in a station full of people who had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young woman, no older than 20, with dark hair and a familiar set to her jaw and eyes the exact shade of gray Callum saw every morning in the mirror, the same eyes he'd seen in his son's face since the day the boy was born. Callum said her name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to physically strike her. Isla flinched, grabbed the younger woman's arm, and began pulling her toward the far doors before he'd even taken a full step forward. He caught up to them on the sidewalk outside, rain starting to needle down around them, and demanded to know how a dead woman was standing in front of him, breathing. Isla wouldn't look at him directly. Her attention fixed instead on a black SUV idling across the street, its windows tinted dark enough that Callum couldn't tell if anyone sat inside. In a voice stripped thin by fear, she told him they couldn't be seen standing together somewhere with cameras, and that every second they lingered increased a danger he didn't yet understand. When he pressed her for an explanation, she asked only one thing, that he take them somewhere no one would think to look. Before Callum could answer, the young woman turned to Isla with a question that landed harder than anything else that afternoon. In a voice caught between hope and disbelief, she asked whether this stranger standing in the rain was truly her father. The garage. Callum drove them to the old storage building behind his shop, a space he used for parts he no longer needed but couldn't bring himself to throw away. For a long moment none of them spoke, while rain drummed against the metal roof. The single bulb overhead buzzed and swayed whenever wind pushed through a gap in the siding, throwing long shadows across shelves crowded with carburetors and coiled hose. The smell of old motor oil settled over the 3 of them, almost comforting in its ordinariness. Callum sat on an overturned crate because his legs didn't entirely trust him to stand. He studied the 2 women across from him the way he might study an engine that refused to start, searching for the one detail that would explain everything. He couldn't stop looking at the young woman, couldn't reconcile the shape of her face with anything he understood about his own history, yet some old instinct in him refused to dismiss what his eyes kept insisting was true. Isla finally broke the silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She told him that when she vanished 20 years earlier, she'd been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. Something cold moved through Callum's chest. Even in the depths of his grief, he'd never imagined a version of the truth that included a daughter he'd never been told about. The young woman introduced herself as Wren Holloway, saying the surname carefully, as though it belonged to a costume rather than a name. She explained that she'd grown up believing her father died before she was born, a story repeated so many times it had calcified into something she'd never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, her mother had finally told her the truth, that her father was alive, living less than a day's drive from where they'd been hiding. Wren didn't call Callum anything resembling a father in that first conversation. Instead, she studied him the way a person studies a stranger who happens to share their face, cataloging the similarities without yet trusting what they might mean. Callum noticed she pressed her fingers against the edge of the table when she grew tense, an unconscious habit identical to one he shared with Devon, and the resemblance rattled him more than any words could have. He told them plainly that 2 decades of lies couldn't be undone by a resemblance, however striking, and that he needed proof before he let himself believe any of it. Isla agreed without hesitation, but warned him they couldn't send a sample to any ordinary laboratory, because Desmond Holloway had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across the region. The name hit Callum like a stone dropped into still water. He remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage, back when Isla's family had made their disapproval of a small-town mechanic marrying into their world unmistakably clear. He understood then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the dead was not a simple story of a woman running from grief, but something far larger and more dangerous than he'd allowed himself to imagine. Before he could ask another question, Isla reached into her bag and set a photograph on the table. Its edges worn soft from handling. It showed Callum walking a 3-year-old Devon into his first day of preschool. An ordinary morning frozen in time, except the photograph had clearly been taken 12 years after the date on Isla's death certificate. What really happened? The story that unfolded that evening carried Callum back 20 years, to a version of his life he'd only ever understood in fragments. Isla had been born into the Holloway family, daughter of the late Edmund Holloway, founder of Holloway Crown Holdings, an empire built across decades of shrewd investment and careful public image. She had never wanted the crown that came with the name, choosing instead to marry a mechanic from a town most of her relatives couldn't locate on a map. She endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint, because Callum had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. In the early years of their marriage, she used to joke that the Holloway name was a coat she'd finally learned to take off, hanging it by the door of their small house and stepping into a life measured in oil changes and grocery lists instead of boardrooms. She believed, foolishly perhaps, that distance alone would be enough to keep the family's ambitions from ever touching the life she'd built for herself. After Edmund died, his younger brother Desmond assumed control of the company. And with it, control over nearly everything the Holloway name still touched. Isla watched her uncle tighten his grip on the family fortune with a patience that unsettled her long before she understood exactly why. 3 days before she disappeared, Isla discovered that Desmond had been siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars out of the company's employee pension fund through a web of shell corporations designed to obscure the trail. Digging further, sleepless and increasingly afraid, she found documents suggesting her own father's signature had been forged across dozens of financial filings in the years before his death, papers that would have exposed a fraud stretching back further than she dared imagine. She decided to gather every piece of evidence she could find and deliver it to federal investigators, believing naively that the truth alone would be enough to protect her family from her uncle's ambition. Desmond learned of her plan before she could act on it. His response was not a threat spoken aloud, but a manila envelope left on her doorstep containing photographs of Callum and Devon taken without their knowledge, proof that her family knew exactly where to find the people she loved most. Thomas Vane, the family's longtime director of security, came to her that same week with an offer that felt less like rescue and more like surrender. He told her that if she wanted her husband and son to remain safe, her grief would need to be real in every detail, because Desmond wouldn't be fooled by a staged disappearance if Callum's mourning ever wavered into something less than genuine. A car resembling Isla's was pushed into Ravenswood Lake and set ablaze before sinking. The dental records used to identify the body recovered from the wreckage had been quietly substituted by someone loyal to the family. Isla told herself, in the earliest days of her exile, that she'd only need to disappear for a few months, just long enough for Thomas to build a case strong enough to protect her when she returned. Those months stretched into years, and the years eventually became 2 decades she never intended to lose. Callum asked her, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never came back once she believed herself safe. Isla's answer came slowly, each word costing her something. She told him that Thomas had once tried to bring her home, arranging the earliest stages of a return that would have reunited her with Callum and introduced him to the daughter he never knew he had. Before that plan could move forward, Thomas vanished without explanation, and every channel Isla had used to communicate with the outside world went silent within days of his disappearance. 20 years of exile. Isla spent those 20 years moving through a patchwork of borrowed names and rented rooms, first through Oregon, then further north into Montana, eventually settling for a time near the Canadian border before finally putting down something resembling roots in a small coastal town in Maine. She learned to live light, keeping a single suitcase packed beneath whatever bed she slept in. She learned the particular loneliness of watching other families gather at diner tables on ordinary Sunday mornings while she sat alone with a newspaper she used more as a shield than a source of news. There were towns where she stayed only weeks, and towns where she stayed years. In every one of them she kept a small photograph of Callum folded inside a coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded too many times in the dark. In the earliest years, Thomas had still been able to send her photographs of Callum and Devon, proof that they remained safe, each image a small mercy that let her sleep through another night of exile. He'd also warned her, again and again, that Desmond's people had never stopped watching Ravenswood, waiting patiently for the moment she made a mistake that would confirm what he already suspected. Isla wrote letters during those years. Dozens of them, addressed to a husband who would never receive a single one, because she trusted no method of delivery except passing them through Thomas, and Thomas alone controlled whether they ever left his hands. When Thomas disappeared, Isla was left with no way to know whether he'd betrayed her, been discovered by Desmond, or simply been erased the way so many inconvenient people in her family's orbit seemed to disappear. Without a trusted intermediary, she convinced herself that any attempt to reach out would place Callum and Devon directly in danger. So she let the silence continue, long after the fear that justified it had curdled into something closer to habit. Callum listened to all of it without softening, unwilling to accept an explanation that reduced his son's entire childhood to a decision made unilaterally on his behalf. He told her plainly that grief he could forgive, but the theft of his right to know the truth about his own life was a different kind of wound entirely. Wren, who'd said little through most of the conversation, finally spoke up, asking her mother whether the same lie had been used to protect both sides of the family from each other. Isla didn't flinch from the accusation. She admitted that fear alone no longer explained everything. That somewhere in the passing years she'd simply lost the ability to imagine what a return might look like, or how she'd begin explaining 20 years of absence to a husband and son who'd already learned to live without her. Callum asked her, more sharply now, why she'd chosen this particular moment to resurface after so long spent hiding. In answer, Isla slid a thick folder across the table, its cover embossed with the small silver crown that marked every official document belonging to Holloway Crown Holdings. Wren would turn 21 in exactly 3 days. And that single fact, Isla explained, carried the power to unravel everything Desmond Holloway had spent 2 decades building. The hidden clause. Edmund Holloway, before his death, had structured a trust that held 51% of the voting shares in Holloway Crown Holdings, a controlling stake designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of consolidation Desmond had since achieved. Desmond had only ever been granted temporary stewardship of those shares under the condition that Isla had died without leaving behind a legitimate heir of her own. A hidden clause within the trust. One Desmond believed had died with Edmund specified that control would automatically revert to Isla, or to her biological child, the moment that child turned 21, and that the transfer would trigger a mandatory audit of every pension fund and corporate account the company controlled. For 20 years, Desmond had built his empire on the confident assumption that Isla was dead and no heir existed to threaten his position. He was, at that very moment, finalizing the sale of a substantial portion of the company to a foreign investment fund, a deal structured to close before Wren's birthday made her legal claim impossible to ignore. Once that sale closed, Isla explained, the financial evidence of Desmond's fraud would be scattered across so many shell companies that even a federal investigation might never fully reconstruct it. She possessed only a copy of the trust's hidden clause, because the sole original document had been hidden by Thomas Vane somewhere in Ravenswood before his disappearance 2 decades earlier. Days before showing up at the train station, Isla had received a recording from a lawyer representing Thomas's estate, a message set to release automatically after his death. In it, Thomas revealed that the original document had been concealed inside something belonging to Callum. Callum felt the memory surface before he consciously reached for it, the image of a wooden toolbox Isla had given him the day he opened his garage, a gift he treasured enough to keep for 20 years without ever suspecting it held anything but wrenches and sockets. The search. The three of them drove back to the shop through streets slick with rain, headlights smearing gold across the wet asphalt, none of them speaking because there seemed to be nothing left that words could accomplish. When they arrived, Callum found the toolbox exactly where it had always sat, undisturbed in the corner of the storage room for 2 full decades, its brass latches dulled with age but still intact beneath a thin film of dust. When he pried it open, his hands weren't entirely steady, and what he found waiting inside wasn't the sealed document Isla had described, but a room that had clearly been searched already. Drawers were overturned, and the lock on the storage door had been forced open sometime before their arrival. Scrawled across the wall behind the emptied toolbox, in handwriting none of them recognized, was a single sentence meant as both warning and threat: the dead ought to know better than to stop staying buried. Shaken but unwilling to retreat, Callum reached out that same night to Harper Voss, a lawyer he trusted since their school years together and the only person he could think of with the expertise to make sense of a trust document this complicated. She arrived at the garage still dressed from a late night at her own office, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and listened to the entire story without once interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from polite skepticism to something closer to alarm as the pieces fell into place. Harper confirmed the clause Isla described could well be legally binding, but cautioned that a photocopy alone would never withstand the scrutiny of a company as well-resourced and well-lawyered as Holloway Crown Holdings. She suggested bringing in Devon, whose career as a forensic data auditor made him uniquely suited to trace the layers of shell companies Desmond had used to hide his fraud. Even though the suggestion meant reopening a wound Callum had spent years trying to protect his son from. Devon arrived in Ravenswood the following morning, fully convinced his father had fallen victim to a pair of elaborate con artists preying on an old man's unresolved grief. He'd rehearsed the entire drive down, a version of the conversation where he gently but firmly talked his father back to reason. That certainty collapsed the moment he saw Isla's face in person, recognizing instantly the same features he'd only ever known from a handful of surviving photographs kept in a drawer his father rarely opened, photographs he used to study as a boy, trying to imagine a voice to match the smile. Something in his chest went hollow and cold, the careful speech he'd prepared dissolving into nothing at all. There was no tearful reunion, no embrace between mother and son separated by 20 years of silence. Instead, Devon asked her, with a controlled fury that surprised even him, where she'd been during every birthday, every graduation, every night his father worked a second job just to keep a roof over their heads. Isla didn't attempt to defend herself against the accusation. She told him simply that she was sorry, and that she understood if forgiveness was something he could never offer her, no matter how much time passed or how much truth eventually came to light. Wren watched the exchange in silence, absorbing for the first time the full weight of what her own survival had actually cost someone else, a half-brother whose childhood had been shaped entirely by an absence she'd never had to endure herself. Before Devon could walk away, something about the proportions of the toolbox caught his attention, a base noticeably thicker than it should have been given its dimensions. Beneath a false panel at the bottom, he found a hidden compartment holding a single object, the antique pocket watch that had once belonged to Edmund Holloway himself. There was no document folded inside, no legal paper to prove anything in a courtroom. Instead, the watch's case concealed only a small brass key and a handwritten string of numbers Devon immediately recognized as belonging to a bank account. He traced the account far enough to discover it corresponded to a safety deposit box that had been frozen on the exact date, 20 years earlier, that Isla was legally declared dead. The pressure campaign. Harper filed an emergency motion the following morning to force the bank to open the frozen deposit box, and word of the filing reached Desmond Holloway faster than any of them anticipated. Within hours, Holloway Crown Holdings launched a coordinated media campaign painting Callum as a man being manipulated by an impostor attempting to extort the family for money, complete with grainy photographs of Callum and Isla standing together at the train station, splashed across local news broadcasts. Longtime customers began canceling contracts with Callum's garage overnight. His bank accounts came under sudden and unexplained scrutiny, and police arrived within the week to search his property based on an anonymous tip claiming he possessed documents stolen from the Holloway family. Callum endured all of it with a grim, practiced patience, understanding by then that Desmond's reach extended into places he'd never imagined a single family could touch. Desmond himself appeared at the garage not long after the police left, arriving without warning and without the security detail Callum had expected a man of his stature to require. Dressed in a coat too fine for a town like Ravenswood, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor with an unhurried confidence that made Callum's jaw tighten, he walked slowly among the half-finished cars, running one gloved finger along a fender as though inspecting merchandise rather than standing inside a stranger's livelihood. He made no direct threats, choosing instead a quieter and more insidious approach. Offering Callum $20 million in exchange for a signed statement declaring that the woman traveling with him was not, in fact, Isla Holloway. Desmond reasoned aloud that Callum owed nothing to a wife who'd allowed him to believe her dead for 2 decades, framing the offer as mercy rather than bribery. For one unsettling moment, standing in his own garage surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, Callum felt something close to temptation. Though it had far less to do with the money than with a rage toward Isla he hadn't yet allowed himself to fully feel. Desmond made his first true mistake in that conversation, referring to Wren by her full legal name, a name known only to Isla, Callum, and Harper, a detail that should have been impossible for him to know unless he'd been tracking the girl for years. The slip told Callum everything he needed to understand about how long Desmond had actually known of his niece's existence, and it hardened whatever resolve had briefly wavered inside him. He refused the offer outright. Within days, a discreet paternity test conducted under Harper's supervision confirmed what Callum had already begun to accept in his heart, that Wren was his daughter, with a probability that left no reasonable room for doubt. Harper warned them immediately afterward that private test results, however conclusive, would never be enough on their own to sway a corporate board loyal to Desmond's version of events. Wren's doubt. That same evening, Desmond sent Wren a private message, crafted with the precision of a man who understood exactly which doubts would cut deepest. It suggested, without offering any specifics, that her mother had never told her the full truth about the night the car went into the lake. Rattled by the message, Wren arranged a secret meeting with Desmond at the Holloway family's downtown hotel, desperate to understand what piece of the story her mother had left incomplete. She sat across from him in a lounge decorated in muted gold and marble, acutely aware that everyone around her seemed to know exactly who he was, while no one had any idea who she was. A strange and unsettling kind of invisibility for a woman who had just learned she stood to inherit half of everything in the room. Desmond presented her with documents showing that Isla had, at one point, been offered a place in a formal witness protection program, a legitimate path to safety she had ultimately declined. He used the revelation carefully, planting the idea in Wren's mind that her mother had never been purely a victim of circumstance, but a woman who had, at least in part, chosen the life of hiding that followed. When Wren confronted her about it later, Isla didn't deny the accusation. She admitted that fear alone hadn't been the whole reason for her refusal, explaining that the program would have required surrendering every piece of evidence she'd gathered and permanently severing her ability to shape the future of the child she was carrying. Isla confessed she'd never been entirely certain whether the official handling her case had already been compromised by Desmond's influence. A suspicion that made the offered protection feel less like safety and more like another kind of trap. Callum remained disappointed by the choice, but found himself beginning to understand, however reluctantly, that nearly every decision Isla had made over 20 years had been shaped by a system Desmond had already learned to bend to his will. The letters. Devon, meanwhile, spent his nights combing through Thomas Vane's old digital records and uncovered dozens of letters Isla had written and mailed to Ravenswood over the years, every one of them rerouted instead to a storage facility owned by a security firm under Holloway control. Desmond, it turned out, had been intercepting his niece's correspondence for the better part of 2 decades, ensuring not a single word of her attempted contact ever reached the family she'd left behind. In the final letter Devon recovered, dated only a week before Thomas vanished, Isla had written that she intended to come home no matter the danger it might bring. The discovery gave Devon a version of his mother he hadn't expected, a woman who genuinely tried to return long before he was ready to forgive her for the years she hadn't. Harper, working a separate angle, tracked down the forensic pathologist who'd originally signed off on the identification of the body recovered from Ravenswood Lake, a woman named Renata Cole, who'd long since left the county coroner's office. Under careful questioning in a small kitchen that still smelled of the coffee she'd brewed out of nervous habit, Renata admitted that the dental records used in the identification had been quietly swapped by a superior before she ever saw the original file, a confession she'd carried in silence for 20 years, out of fear for her own career and safety. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, and she confessed she'd thought about that file more nights than she could count, wondering whether the woman she'd unknowingly helped erase was out there somewhere, still alive, still waiting for someone to tell the truth. She agreed to testify, but only if Harper could guarantee her legal protection from whatever retaliation Desmond might attempt once her statement became public. With Renata's cooperation secured, Harper finally succeeded in forcing open the long-frozen safety deposit box tied to the numbers hidden inside Edmund Holloway's pocket watch. Instead of the original trust document they'd all hoped to find, the box contained nothing but an empty envelope and a single photograph, one showing Owen Farrow, the company's longtime chief financial officer, removing something from the very same box a full decade earlier. The boardroom. With Wren's birthday now less than a day away, Desmond convened an emergency meeting of the company's board of directors, determined to push the foreign investment sale through before midnight, before the clause that would strip him of the authority to approve it alone could take effect. Callum, Isla, Wren, Devon, and Harper arrived together at the towering Holloway Crown headquarters, its glass facade catching the last orange light of evening, only to be stopped at the lobby entrance because Isla remained, on every official record, a woman who had been legally dead for 20 years. Security guards in dark suits formed a quiet wall in front of the elevators, polite but immovable, and for several tense minutes it seemed as though the entire confrontation might end there, in a marble lobby, before it had even properly begun. Harper fought to secure entry using Renata Cole's sworn statement as leverage, demanding the board delay any vote until the question of Isla's identity could be formally addressed. Desmond met them in the lobby himself, visibly amused, mocking Callum in front of several arriving board members as nothing more than a small-town mechanic whose greed had finally gotten the better of him. It was Owen Farrow, arriving unannounced and clearly agitated, who changed the direction of the entire confrontation. He confirmed, without being asked, that he had indeed removed documents from the safety deposit box exactly 10 years earlier. A fact everyone in the room initially assumed would only strengthen Desmond's position. Instead, Owen revealed that Thomas Vane himself had asked him to safeguard the original trust document years before his disappearance, fearing correctly that even a bank vault wouldn't remain safe from Desmond's reach forever. Owen admitted he'd stayed silent for a decade only because Desmond had threatened to pin the company's entire pattern of financial fraud squarely on him if he ever spoke a word of what he knew. What finally broke his silence was the realization that Desmond intended to liquidate the very pension fund thousands of ordinary employees depended on, a betrayal Owen found he could no longer carry alone. He'd spent 30 years climbing the company's ranks, had trained himself to believe smaller compromises didn't matter. But he couldn't stand in a room and watch factory workers and receptionists lose their retirements to fund a stranger's yacht and a private island somewhere off the coast of a country he couldn't even pronounce correctly. He produced the original trust document on the spot, along with independently verified copies of the paternity results, Renata Cole's signed statement, and the intercepted letters Devon had painstakingly traced back to Holloway-owned storage facilities. The papers were spread across the long mahogany table one by one, each document landing with a quiet finality that seemed to hush the entire room. Several board members who'd spent years nodding along to Desmond's decisions now sat in visible discomfort, unable to meet his eyes. The evidence left no room for doubt, confirming both that Isla Holloway Ashford was alive and that Wren stood as the legitimate heir to a controlling interest in the company her grandfather had built. Desmond made one final, desperate attempt to force the foreign sale through before the clock struck midnight. But the moment Wren's birthday arrived, his temporary authority over the disputed shares was automatically suspended by the very clause he'd spent 20 years believing no longer existed. Wren now held the deciding voice over 51% of Holloway Crown holdings, a fact that visibly unsettled Desmond more than any accusation leveled against him that night, because he clearly expected retribution equal to everything he'd taken from her family. After standing before the seat that had once belonged to her grandfather, Wren made her first decision as the company's newly recognized controlling shareholder. She didn't choose to remove Desmond from the board out of vengeance. Instead, she ordered the company's entire financial history opened without restriction to federal investigators. Desmond Holloway was suspended from his position within days, facing formal charges of fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. His empire was dismantled not through any dramatic act of revenge, but through the quiet weight of paperwork he'd spent 2 decades believing was permanently under his control. Isla refused every suggestion that she step into the role of chief executive herself, choosing instead to hand day-to-day authority to an independent oversight board, while insisting, as her first and only non-negotiable condition, that the depleted pension fund be restored to every employee it had once belonged to. Wren, for her part, wanted no part of a life defined entirely by inherited wealth and corporate obligation. She agreed to retain her voting authority but chose to remain focused on finishing her education, involving herself only in the company's most significant ethical decisions rather than its daily operations. Devon wasn't yet ready to call Isla his mother, and he made no pretense otherwise. But he agreed to let her write to him again. This time using a real address, with no intermediary standing between them, and he found himself, against his own expectations, checking the mailbox a little more eagerly than he would have admitted to anyone. Wren asked her father, quietly and without any real expectation, whether he wanted to run the paternity test a second time now that the truth carried no legal urgency behind it. Callum told her he didn't need another piece of paper to confirm what he'd already understood the moment he first saw her eyes at the train station. Isla asked him for a chance to begin again, though she asked it carefully, without any assumption that the years lost between them could simply be waved away by good intentions. Callum didn't slide his wedding ring back onto his finger that night, and he didn't pretend that 20 years of grief and silence could be forgiven in a single conversation. He told her plainly that the marriage they'd once shared had ended the day the world declared her dead, and that whatever came next between them would have to be something new built honestly from the ground up, rather than salvaged from what had been lost. Isla accepted that condition without argument, and for a moment something in her posture eased, as though she'd been braced for a harsher answer than the one he'd given. She asked, almost tentatively, whether she might come back to the garage the following morning. Callum considered the question for a long moment before answering. Tomorrow, he told her, sounded like a reasonable place to start. A year later. A year passed before Ravenswood truly settled back into something resembling ordinary life, though nothing about it felt quite the same as it had before. Ashford Restoration reopened under a freshly painted sign, but Callum kept the old wooden toolbox exactly where it had always sat in the corner of his office, a reminder he had no interest in packing away. Holloway Crown Holdings entered a long and painful process of restructuring under new oversight, its pension fund gradually restored to the employees who'd been quietly robbed of it, while Desmond awaited trial and former allies within his own network chose cooperation with investigators over continued loyalty to a man whose empire had already collapsed. Devon began having dinner with Isla every few weeks. Cautious and imperfect, the two of them relearning each other slowly rather than pretending 20 years apart could be erased through effort alone. Wren spent her school breaks working part-time at the garage, admitting freely that she had little natural talent for engine repair and often left smudges of grease on her jeans that never quite washed out. Still, she discovered, almost by accident, that she could recognize a faulty engine sound with the same instinctive ear her father had. Isla and Callum hadn't remarried, choosing instead to date cautiously, arguing sometimes over small things, relearning each other's habits and history without flinching away from the parts of the past that still ached. On a quiet afternoon many months later, with autumn light slanting low through the open bay doors and the radio humming an old song neither of them bothered to name, Callum stood beside Wren in front of a fully restored Mustang gleaming under the shop's fluorescent lights, its work finally complete after months of careful attention. The car's paint caught the light the way it had the day Isla first gave him the toolbox, a coincidence Callum chose to notice rather than dismiss. Wren caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the very first time since the day they met at that rain-soaked train station, she called him something other than a stranger who happened to share her face. She called him Dad. Callum didn't answer right away. He set down the wrench in his hand, wiped his palm slowly against a rag that had been his father's before it was his, and let the moment settle over him the way sunlight settles over a room after a long storm finally passes. He only smiled, watching the gray eyes that had once dragged his entire past back into the present, eyes that were no longer a reminder of everything he had lost, but a quiet promise of everything still ahead.